My road to Huey Lewis was Back to the Future. I really got it in my head that this was going to be like a Huey Lewis in the News kind of record.
How
um,
so?
well, here's what I love about, let's say, okay, so I'll talk specifically about sports, that the record sports from Huey
Just
Lewis
had
in the
its
News.
anniversary last Friday, 40th anniversary last Friday.
I know, I'm so happy. I was one of my favorite records ever. And here's why is because it has, um, I mean, it has a lot of what this record has, which is kind of a straightforward rock band setup, meaning like, guitar, drums, bass, vocalist, and some energy, plus the fun bar band energy of like there's horns coming in and doing lines. But not just that, there's a million bands that do that. It's really every single instrument and every single vocal part is pretty hooky, and you can sing it and you can walk away remember, and nothing is just there doing busy work. It all either it has a voice and it's saying something, or it goes, or it's supporting what has a voice.
Hmm.
So that comes from a real songwritery conceptual angle to sort of tie it to that. But and you know what, that record, sports, now I'm just obsessively talking about sports, but that record was one of the I'm not going to say one of the only, because a lot of records did this. That in 1984, Lindrum, this drum machine, became really accessible, and it's on a million records. It's on Purple Rain and all the Madonna stuff of that time. Some of the late, or really some of the mid, like new wave punky stuff that was happening. Lindrum being like, oh, we're replacing drums, actual real live rock drums, with program sequence synthesizers, which as a live musician is kind of a bummer, but as a composer and songwriter, it really forces you into this, like, no, we're really going to come up with, like, we're going to think about what every single beat is. Um, yes, we're going to lead with our heart, but we're really going to scrutinize over every single sort of rhythm, and does it serve the song?
Okay, so were you saying that sports was one of the first to utilize Lindrum or popularize or one of the first to break that had that sound that eventually became, as the decade went on, the sort of
Uh,
like standard
more
80s production touch?
I would say that that year, like 1984, 1985,
Hmm.
between sports, Thriller, Purple Rain, Madonna, between all those records that charted for like half a decade, those were all like based on that Lindrum thing. Like, I, for the first time, we're I mean, so Huey Lewis had that old school doo-woppy songwriting thing, and then bring in, hey, it's the '80s now, and we're starting to integrate synthesized instruments in a way that I think we're both still meshing very nicely.
What made you think of sports, and how? First of all, how old are you? When did you first hear it? Because
Yeah.
it does, like, you're my guess is you weren't hearing that in 1983, or even maybe necessarily born yet.
Well, I'm older than you think, but now that I've said that, I'm a little less than you're thinking now. So my road to Huey Lewis was Back to the Future.
Of
Um,
course. I mean,
yeah.
who? So okay, so you saw Back to the Future when, though?
Okay, so I'm born 1984. I saw
Back
Back
to
to
the
the
Future is
Future on
85.
TV. Yeah,
Okay,
I,
yeah,
I
okay,
didn't catch it till it was on TV reruns later, right?
okay, yeah. So I was born in 72, and I saw it with my
Hmm.
mom in the theater, and Purple Rain,
Oh,
actually.
oh, I just saw Purple Rain for the first time, who also had its anniversary recently. I love the record, but when I never went and saw I went to a screening, and it blew my, it's like before what I said about COVID, like everything is now before or after. For me personally, it's before and after seeing Purple Rain. It's my new milestone.
So, okay, so you might find this amusing. I don't know whether I should share this, but I'm definitely going to. Well, I don't know whether I should, but I know I should. So
Mm-hmm.
when I went to see Purple Rain with my mom, I might have
Mm-hmm.
already had the tape. I can't remember if the album was out before the film. I'm pretty sure it was because I
Okay.
think for me to have been interested in going to see it, I would have I was already into the tape. And I would think the singles built up. I would think Let's Go Crazy was out well before that.
Mm-hmm.
But we can of course look that up. And I remember, and so my mom came home, and I she was talking to a friend of hers, a girlfriend of hers, presumably, and I overheard her on the phone saying, "Oh my goodness, you think by looking at him that he might be gay, but he just exudes this raw sexuality."
Hell
And I
yeah.
watched the film, and I was like, "Oh well, it kind of like." She thought, well, maybe he's gay because he was toying with a lot of this, like what we would now call non-heteronormative
Yes, absolutely.
presentation. And so, I mean, he was obviously like fishing for people to think that. And then
Mm-hmm.
my mom was like, "Oh, but he had this raw, just this exudes this raw sexuality."
Hell yeah. Way ahead of his time.
So, so just thought that was that's my mate. That's what I remember the most from the film, other than some scene where his father gets really.
Yeah,
I don't
there's
remember how
a
violent it was, or like, well, really intense in the house, and he like storms out and
yeah.
goes to maybe goes to the club or something, or goes to rehearsal or something.
Uh,
I also remember the line, "We're still a group, right?" Do you know what I'm talking about?
no, when is that?
That's where there's some dispute in the band, and
Okay.
one of the other band members in the Revolution's like, "We're still a group, right?" Or something.
Well, I
That's
appreciated that so much about that movie was, of course, he comes off looking incredible and everything is great, but that's because he's awesome. But he also puts through like there's conflict within the band. Um, I don't know if this is true, but at least in the movie, he puts forth that like other members of the band wrote Purple Rain. I don't think that's even true, but like a generous, you think of a rock star trying to make everything of himself to look like I'm the coolest one. People in that movie and in his band in that movie kind of make fun of him, and he still comes off looking amazing. Um, yeah, I love and that all adds up to just like the courage and like he could pull it off. He could pull anything off.
so. It
It's
sounds
good
like
stuff.
you had the experience that I had with the '70s, which is
Uh,
so I was born in '72, but I was really young
mhm.
throughout most of the decade to the point where I remember it more like a dream.
Yeah,
It's not very solid for me at all. Although there's a little bit of it. Like I do remember certain things about the Yankees World Series, and but it's almost past the point where I can grasp it. It's there's some of it in my grasp. So I really grew up in the '80s
yeah,
and went back and bought a bunch of classic rock records, went through the whole catalog of all these classic rock bands. But for me, from like coming from like 1983, 84, 85 onward, I was only 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. And it felt like I was like digging up like ancient history, even though that was
right.
only the decade before. But in my mind, these were like might as well have been like Egyptian artifacts or something that it was such a sense of going into the distant, deep past,
Yeah,
which I can't imagine why I can't get back into that framework now because I mean now that stuff's like 50 years old, but
right.
just a decade ago doesn't seem like that long at all.
Right. I
Um,
mean, but the production styles change so much from 70s to 80s, you know?
yes, so drastically. And so a lot of the bands that were still active from the classic rock era sounded totally different.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so you were alive, when Back to the Future was released, but then had this moment later when you're like a young kid.
Totally.
And this is probably has to be like what the early 90s or something.
Yeah, mid to early 90s is when I feel like I start really like connecting to music and realizing what's going on. And if I had to guess like the year, it would be like 94. I'm 10 years old. And I just, all I remember is the summer of going to Amazing Skates and like the skating rink around Long Island where they were playing Weezer the Blue Album. I remember playing Donkey Kong Country with my friends while Green Day Dookie and Ace of Base were playing on repeat. Uh, that was must have been Nirvana was probably doing that, maybe Unplugged that year. Um, but a couple records that I mean, Grace came out that year, but it took me a while to discover that one from Jeff Buckley. But yeah, right around the mid '90s when I start connecting to paying attention to music.
Right. And it sounds like you had the feeling for 80s production values that I had for classic rock
Sure.
uh,
Yeah.
production values. Now, meanwhile, I'm living through the 80s, Purple
Uh-huh.
Rain, Duran
Uh-huh.
Duran, um, Tears for Fears, all of
Yeah.
that stuff is like all over radio.
Hell yeah.
So much so that I was liking a lot of it. Like I liked Duran Duran, but I was resisting some of it too as like kind of soft, too poppy for my
Yeah.
snobby taste. I'm listening to like Black Sabbath and heavy stuff and
Hell yeah.
Metallica and things like that. And I'm like resisting. And then about 20 years later, into you get into like the early 2000s. Is it the early 2000s? No, actually, it didn't even take that long. 15 years later, 1997 ish,
Yeah.
I hear one of Tears for Fears' biggest hits from Songs from the Big Chair in a bar through the PA, and I didn't even recognize that it was them. I thought, oh, is this Thompson Twins? Um, but the sound is so magnificent. I felt like I was like swimming in the music, and I was like, damn, this is like because for some reason you hear music out and it sounds more powerful. I don't know why that is. Obviously,
Mm,
there's the acoustics, right? You can get a good PA system in a bar, but like you could bring that same PA system to your house, set up like a fucking movie theater type listening, and you still wouldn't feel the same way for some reason as you do when you're out. So
yeah.
that's when I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. A lot of this 80s stuff that I would have been like,
I
too
know.
poppy, too soft for me is amazing. And that has since actually become one of my favorite albums, Desert Island Discs,
Hell
Songs
yeah.
from the Big Chair. And the production, from a production standpoint, I just think is like one of the most amazingly produced records. So I used to freak. I was working in a recording studio right after that, and I used to freak the metal bands out because they'd bring in their like they'd bring in like Mudvayne and Slipknot or whatever, whoever they wanted
Right.
to sound like, and I'd be like, okay, cool, cool, cool. I get it. You want to sound like that, but check this out. And some of them be like, whoa, whoa, that doesn't sound like us. But the band members who loved production would be like, oh, no, no, no. I hear what you're, you know.
Hmm.
And I took it for granted as a kid how revolutionary those sounds, which really started in the disco era.
Hmm. Yeah.
Diana Ross or Donna Summer, excuse me, Donna Summer, that Georgia Moroder, Donna Summer
Right.
thing coming into disco right up into the 80s. How just like what a revolution in sound that was, and I'm just a kid, so I'm not really grasping what a drastic turn this is.
Yeah.
And I didn't mention I just wrote a piece of the 40th anniversary, or I wrote an anniversary piece about sports that ran
Woo.
on Friday
Ooh, I gotta
and
check it out. Where can I see this?
on Paste. I'll send it to you.
Oh, hell
And I
yeah.
was just about to finish editing a podcast episode because I'm getting my podcast finally up. But I'd actually like to include some of this, if you don't mind,
Yeah,
on there, these insights, because this is like incredible timing actually. Um,
yeah.
because I really like the perspective you're adding. I didn't even talk about the Lindrum on there. For me, what I think is remarkable is they are basically giving at that point basically almost all of the rock and roll element the way I described it, almost all the rock and roll element is practically gone, but there's still an organic heart beating in the music. So there's this incredible 80s production pop polish on everything, and they're writing songs
Right.
specifically trying to be more hooky. But
Yeah.
if you went to see Huey Lewis like 5 years before that, if you saw them in San Francisco as a bar band, you wouldn't relate to anything on this record other than the songs, but it still sounds very human. The other
Yeah.
thing I noticed is right as the album starts, like right away, there's this guitar line, a keyboard line, and like a very thin kind of drum groove that
Right.
sound like Knight Rider or something, or like electro music. But not all of it is as synthetic as it initially sounds. There's this
Right.
interlocking
Yes.
that thing. Some of that is actually just like a clean guitar line, and some of it is synth. And it's like right on the line between like electronic and organic.
Yes.
Um, Whereas I think the record after that totally sounds like pop fluff, like sounding. It's big, it's inflated. This is actually really spare. I compared
Yep.
it to Devo,
Hmm.
the production style. Um, it's really spare. It's really like I said, it's like a band from inside a video game, what that would sound like. But then it occurred to me in the 80s, you were hearing this stuff through the air. You were hearing it on radios in people's cars. You were hearing it like out and about. Even if you had a Walkman, the headphones were not sealing. They weren't like, you're hearing the street. Like,
Right.
and so bands who have come along and borrowed, they have these like these plugins that sound like Bell Biv DeVoe drum sounds or whatever. Like bands that are borrowing that, who didn't live through that period, I think they're too literal about it. They want it to sound flat and cold and completely synthetic. Whereas back at the time, you needed the air to enliven this music.
Oh yeah.
So that's my point. I'll send you my thing, and
That's beautiful.